Thank you for attending today's webinar. And so what we're going to talk about today is Oracle eBusiness Suite security myths. So the foundation of this webinar was basically questions that we get and statements from our customers and clients when we're doing security assessments on site. Things that, no, that's not quite right. I'll have to explain it to you why that doesn't work in Oracle eBusiness Suite security. So what we did was kind of compiled a lot of those different questions and statements from our clients and said, okay, let's go through, and we are hearing the same thing over and over and over. A lot of other people also must be thinking that these things are true. The list of security myths will be not in any particular order. I kind of did it from general to more specific, and I'll kind of highlight some of the ones that we see quite often. So kind of let's get started. I want to give a brief overview of Integrity for those of you on the call today that aren't familiar with Integrity. We basically specialize in Oracle eBusiness Suite security. We were founded in 2001, and our purpose back then was to work with clients to help improve the security of their Oracle eBusiness Suite implementations. We do two parts of our business. One is the product side, that we actually have some tools that help you secure the Oracle eBusiness Suite, App Sentry and App Defend. And then we also do services that are a lot of times on site. We also do them remote, doing security assessments, helping with security design services. So if you have a particular auditing problem, maybe around PCI, those are the type of things that we help our clients with. We get the question quite often is, how do you know so much about Oracle eBusiness Suite security? Well, we've been doing it for over 10 years, and we actually do a lot of research and development internally. So we found a lot of different security bugs fixed as part of the critical patch updates. So we know a lot about how the critical patch updates work, what kind of security bugs are in those, and things like that. So enough about Integrity. Let's now start talking about some security myths with the Oracle eBusiness Suite. So the first one that we sometimes get, this one is really not that common, but we do hear it more often than you'd actually like to hear. And it's really Oracle eBusiness Suite is secure. Oracle gave us a secure product. They basically sold us, and the sales guy said, it works great out of the box. Yeah, it's secure. There's no big problems in it and things like that. Well, hopefully everyone on the call, if you're at least concerned about security, you know this one isn't true. That you actually have to do a significant amount of effort in order to secure the application. At a minimum, there's a number of Oracle support notes out there talking about the secure configuration guide, how to secure it in a DMZ and things like that. So this isn't a very simple process. You have to go through a lot of different steps and effort to make the application secure. And let me give you some examples of why the application isn't secure out of the box. One example is when you get an Oracle eBusiness Suite database, well, there's several hundred database accounts. Well, out of the box, each of those database accounts is active, and by the way, the password is equal to the username. So as an example, there's a GL database account, and that's for the general ledger module. Each module has a database account, and then there's about a couple dozen others. But each of those has a default password. So if you just kind of set up your database and leave it there without changing some default passwords, anyone can go into the application using any of those 300 database accounts, and all those database accounts have enough privileges that you could take over the entire database. As an example, the general ledger account owns all the general ledger data, so you could easily manipulate that. But there's actually some specific executes on several apps procedures that would allow that user to execute any code within the Oracle eBusiness Suite database. So those are kind of important. So this is just one example of things that you have to be thinking about when you're trying to secure the eBusiness Suite. Another example is seeded application accounts. Well, Oracle comes with about 20 seeded application accounts, and these are at the application level. So when you sign on to the application, well, just next time you go in, try ASG ADM and try the password welcome. Well, in a lot of different versions, that has system administrator responsibility by default. Hopefully the DBA has gone through and taken the secure configuration guide from Oracle and disabled all the necessary accounts. But here's just an example. And these aren't trivial type responsibilities either. That's one of the other keys here is, yeah, there's 20 accounts with default passwords. They're fully enabled. But they also have some very significant privileges behind them. Not all of them. This is kind of some of the most egregious examples of the responsibilities, but if you see on this list, there's a lot of administrator type responsibilities, so you can do a lot of different things in the application. So you have to be very careful when you go through and secure it. Again, here's the effort. You got to go through 20 different accounts, secure them one by one. There are some scripts out there that you can actually lock down some of these accounts a little bit quicker, but it's best just to go through each one and make sure that they're disabled, the responsibilities are indated, passwords are changed. Another example is the application password settings. So Oracle gives you the capability to do pretty stringent passwords within the application, but by the way, they're not really enabled by default. So there's no complexity required for passwords out of the box. The password minimum length was actually upgraded from 5 to 6 in R12. No case-sensitive passwords, no password reuse settings are enabled by default. So here's another case where you actually have to go through and configure the application and try to have it match your organization's password policy. It's not super complicated, but it just requires effort, someone to have understanding what each of these settings do and go through. So what are those steps that are actually, we'll do one more before I jump into the steps that you have to do. Another example of something a little bit more cryptic, and that's not, and I use that as a pun, not as readily knowledgeable to most people, is the password decryption. So when you get an Oracle EBusiness Suite environment, it's storing all the application users' passwords in the FND user table. Well, by default, those passwords are encrypted, not hashed. When something's encrypted, that means basically there's an encryption key and I can reverse the encryption and basically decrypt it and get the password back. Hashing is a one-way type procedure. So basically, if I hash it, I really can never get back the original value. I can test it by hashing another value and see if those hashes match. By default, even in R12, Oracle encrypts the passwords and stores them in the FND user table. If you go out and Google Oracle Applications Password Decryption, there's very detailed instructions on the internet how to basically decrypt all those passwords. So if someone goes into your eBusiness Suite environment and has access to the FND user table, they can basically decrypt all the passwords there. And if it's maybe a development environment and you haven't changed every single user password when you've cloned from production to development, someone, maybe one of your developers, can go into development, get all the passwords for production, and then go in as a user in production, maybe your AP manager, and start entering vendors and invoices and things like that and cutting checks. So this is a very powerful vulnerability within the application. And by the way, it's one of the steps in the steps that you have to secure the application by changing the default encryption to basically allow hashing. So when we kind of talk about what should you have to do in order to secure the Oracle EBusiness Suite, well, Oracle provides you some very good secure configuration guides for both 11i and R12. So you really have to be going through each of those guides and taking each item one by one and going through and securing that setting. Some of the settings are pretty easy. It's just kind of go through and change a password or change something else. Others actually require much more significant effort in terms of turning on auditing, applying patches, things like that. So if you're running a DMZ environment, well, there's more MetaLink notes on how to actually configure your DMZ environment. Oracle EBusiness Suite originally was never designed to be on the internet. They've had to take some kludges to kind of get it secure, to limit how much is exposed on the internet, what people can access, and things like that. And that's what these DMZ documents do, is they go through a very rigid step-by-step procedure on how to lock down the externally facing Oracle EBusiness Suite environment. The goal is, if you're running iSupplier on the internet, you just want to be running iSupplier on the internet. And I'll talk later about why that's an issue. Well, if those couple of MetaLink notes weren't enough, well, there's even more. So if you want to now start enabling SSL encryption across your internal network so the passwords aren't in clear text when they're transferred around. If you want to implement transparent data encryption in case you've got credit cards or social security numbers in your environment. So there's a lot of different steps in the environment that has to be secured. So it's really not even close to being secure out of the box. There's a lot of effort and dedicated effort that has to be done to make it a secure application. So now let's start with another myth, kind of building on that previous one is, well, if I go through the secure configuration guide as provided by Oracle, am I secure? And a lot of people think that's true. Well, if I just go through and implement most items, I don't need to necessarily do every single item. Well, if I do most of it, I should be secure, right? Well, that's not the case. When we look at the secure configuration guide, we view everything in there as a base minimum. And then there's additional steps on top of that. Some of the additional steps start talking about, what do I have in my environment? So when we look at an Oracle EBusiness Suite environment, we look at it from a risk and a threat model. So here's some examples of some risks and threats. So if I've got Social Security numbers, credit cards in my numbers in my environment, well, I have a big risk of data theft. If someone comes in and steals my Social Security numbers, I now have a breach. I have to notify all those people that they lost their Social Security number and things like that. And then what we've done is mapped that to a number of key issues within the application. So database passwords. So if you have a data theft, most likely someone can connect to the database directly, use a default password, get in and steal that data. So this chart kind of just goes through some common areas and key risks to the application, and kind of some of the areas where you have to think about applying patches, fixing default passwords, turning on auditing, how do you do change control and things like that. Another area that we often see is direct entering of transactions. So if I can get in your database, potentially I can change bank account numbers. Wouldn't that be kind of cool to go in and change the bank account number for all your HR employees and then actually have all those direct deposits go into my bank account? I'm probably going to get caught pretty quickly, but that's actually, we've seen that happen before. That's not an unknown type of fraud that can happen. Some people aren't that smart and they'll do stupid things like that, and it just takes a lot of effort. All your employees have now lost their numbers. And actually, surprisingly, we've seen that go through at banks. So you think, oh, somebody's going to catch that. The bank will catch that, or somebody will catch that. That's not always the case. There's certain cases that have gone through, and people say, well, they updated 100 bank account numbers, and you got 100 direct deposits, and that worked. It went through every single control, and was caught later on, a few days later, when people started complaining, but it was never caught initially when it happened. So these things happen in the real world, and you have to be aware of it, and you have to be kind of watching out for it. So if you kind of start now looking at some of the top security vulnerabilities, well, Secure Configuration Guide covers a lot of them, but doesn't cover all of them. So we're 1 and 2, default passwords, are pretty well covered. But direct database access really isn't talked much about in the Secure Configuration Guide. How are we using the database directly? Do I have ad hoc reporting enabled? How are people pulling reports from? How does my support team access the database to look up things? How do the DBAs access the database? How about application security design? Do I have my application security controls in place correctly? How are my change control procedures? Who's allowed to actually migrate code into production? Could they migrate some malicious code into production? Database auditing is covered in the Secure Configuration Guide, but it's not dealing with how do I actually monitor it? What am I looking for in that application and audit trail, the database audit trail? How do I actually move that database audit trail off the database in case someone that does get into the database is able to compromise the sys account and can actually delete the audit trail? So there's a lot of things that beyond the Secure Configuration Guide they have to be thinking about and looking at. This is not an exhaustive list. This is kind of what we view as the top 10 things that you have to be thinking about when you're securing an Oracle E-Business Suite, but there's actually a lot more things that you have to be thinking about. And these are very specific to an organization. Risk and threats are very important. If you have an environment that's connected to the internet, that's very different if it's only internally accessible. If you've got Social Security numbers, it's very different than if you don't have any sensitive data. If you have credit card numbers, then you have to be PCI compliant. So there's a lot of different things you have to be thinking about, and how you secure and how much effort you spend to secure your environment will matter on what you actually do with the E-Business Suite, how much data you have, things like that. So again, when we're talking about the Secure Configuration Guide, here's a number of other MetaLink notes that don't cover things beyond the Secure Configuration Guide. So once you do the Secure Configuration Guide, then you have to be thinking about what do we have to do next? What's the risks and threats to our database and our E-Business Suite environment that we have to be concerned with? So that's kind of at a higher level on MIS 1 and 2, talking about the E-Business Suite in general. So the next one that we get a lot, and this is actually pretty common, and when we go through and do our security assessments, people think, well, we hardened it at go live. Go live might have been a month ago, it might have been a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. And a lot of people haven't spent much time since they went live. They went through the Secure Configuration Guide, they hardened their environment, and they did a pretty good job. And they said, well, we're secure because we actually went through. And it's actually a very common one when we meet with the CIO. The CIO said, well, I talked to the DBAs and they told me they hardened it and it was all set. Well, that was 2 years ago. Are you still secure today? And the reality is no. E-Business Suite security decays over time. And you have to be routinely checking and validating security, finding default passwords, applying patches and things like that. Because what happens as we go through over time, you might install it well, you go through, you install the application, you do a lot of customization, and hopefully at go live you did do some hardening. You went through the secure configuration guide and made sure all the passwords are changed, you've got the latest critical patch updates installed and things like that. But what happens over time is after go live, well, security patches have to be applied. New vulnerabilities are found and published out on the internet. You're upgrading the application, you're doing application upgrades, you're doing database upgrades, you're doing more customizations. Mary from accounting also wants a database account. Well, is she doing a secure password for a database account? So all these things are working in tandem to basically lessen the security or decay the security of our Oracle E-Business Suite environment. Now, let's give you some examples. When we do our security assessments, Integrity actually gathers up and anonymizes the data, but then we kind of go through it, and this is an example of database passwords. We check every single database password, and when we find a default, we actually add it to a list and try to compile some statistics. So these are basically from about 120 production databases. I would say it's about half ERP systems. The rest are a lot of different data warehouses, other critical databases. And we actually went through and find how often does each account exist in a database, and then how often have we found a default password. So most of these systems should have been hardened, but as you can see, well, the DBAs are very good at changing the system account. Especially Oracle in 10G and 11G have changed the way when it's installed. They change the password when you actually install it. A lot of these other accounts should have had their password changed also. But as we see different things happen over time, like the DBMS MP account gets reset, or especially with the CTX-SYS. We see the CTX-SYS password getting reset all the time, that the DBAs swear they changed it, they're positive they changed it. But in a third of the databases we did a security assessment on, we found the CTX password is equaling CTX-SYS. 10G and prior, that account actually has some significant privileges and can take over the entire database. So as you can see, even though you think you were secure, well, default passwords pop up. It's not uncommon. And there's a number of different ways that can happen. That can happen via patches. Maybe there's a procedure that one of the DBAs had that said, well, to do something, please reset the CTX-SYS password. We found that over time in Oracle documentation, so there's some MetaLink notes out there. They give you a detailed procedure, and they say, well, change the CTX-SYS password to CTX-SYS, run this patch. Well, at the end of the procedure, there's no, oh, by the way, change the CTX-SYS password again. Another way that we often see database accounts getting default passwords is when you actually do an upgrade. So if you upgraded from 11i to R12, well, as you remember, every module in the eBusiness Suite has a database account. So what happens when new modules are installed? Well, when you do an upgrade, even if it's going from 11i to R12 or going from 12.1 to 12.3, there's new modules, and each module has a database account and then has a default password. So each of these accounts here, CA, the password CA. So when you did your R12 upgrade, you actually installed a new default account, CA, with the default password CA. Oh, by the way, now someone has an opening into the eBusiness Suite. So there's a lot of different things that are happening. So just because you hardened it at go live a while ago, every single time you do an upgrade, apply a patch, or do any other significant changes, there's a potential that you're opening a new security hole. So security is not a static item. It's a routine process that you have to go through and secure it over time. You have to be validating security on a regular basis. As part of the Secure Configuration Guide MetaLink note, Oracle now provides some limited SQL scripts that help. So those are actually as part of the MetaLink note. You can download the SQL scripts. Those will check some of the things in the Secure Configuration Guide. Another way to check default passwords for the database, this is one area that we see people often go after. So, there's a number of cases where that's how people got into the database. They went after default passwords. Oracle's got a default view starting with 10G, DBA users with def password. There's a patch that installed it in 10G, and as part of 11G, this is actually a view that's always there. So if you just query that view, DBA users with default password, it'll actually tell you for a limited set of accounts. It's most eBusiness Suite accounts, it's most standard Oracle accounts, but it's not every account. There's about 700 on the list, and it'll check one, maybe two passwords for each account. So that's actually a very good starting point. But it doesn't give you the full story because it's not checking every single account. So if Mary from accounting has a database account, it won't check her password. In order to do that, you need to have a third-party tool. So there's a number of command line tools out there. If you look up a tool in Google or a BF or a brute force, that's a publicly available tool that will actually check all the account passwords and run multiple iterations. So it'll check username, it'll check against a dictionary, it'll check all combinations under like 5 characters and things like that. These tools run very fast, so you can check millions of passwords in a couple seconds. Integrity, we have our own tool, AppSentry, that will actually check the security of Oracle E-Business Suite in the Oracle database. And so when we check all the database account passwords using our tool, we're actually checking more than 1 million passwords per account. And that takes us about 7 seconds per account. So these are very, very fast tools due to problems with the way the Oracle database hash works for passwords. It's very rapid to check a lot of passwords. So anyone can basically, if they can get into the DBA user table in 10G and 11G, it's going to be user dollar, and get the password hashes, they can take it home and actually crack them offline. So that's a very doable thing. So you need to really check that you have very secure passwords at the database level. Well, another area, so as we see, database passwords are changing. Other things are changing in the environment too. Application users are added. So when you're doing upgrades at the application level, well, remember all those application accounts, ASG, ADM that I talked about before? Well, Oracle's still adding those into the environment. Fortunately, not as many as they used to at all. And now they're locking them down, but these are still getting added. So things are changing every time you do an upgrade, every time you apply a patch. You're changing the environment and you're potentially changing security settings. There are some cases where actually people have changed security settings and then an Oracle patch comes along and actually resets that value. It's not as common as it used to be, but those type of things happen. So you always have to be checking security. You always have to be validating that you have a secure environment. So we're talking about making sure the environment's secure. Now, there's kind of, I took this myth and broke it into two because it depends on your perspective. So if you're the DBA, the myth is that your IT security team is protecting the Oracle E-Business Suite. And if you're the IT security team, the myth is your DBAs are protecting the Oracle E-Business Suite. You can really see where this one's coming from, that, well, everyone else is thinking that the Oracle E-Business Suite is being protected by somebody. Someone's doing their due diligence securing the environment. Well, that's really not the case. Securing the Oracle E-Business Suite is hard, and it really takes not just one person, one DBA to do it, but really a large group of people working together. So the Oracle DBAs, the project team, IT security, internal audit, all have to work together to form a team because they each bring something to the table to make sure that the environment is secured. Because really what's happening in the organization is there's a misalignment. Oracle Business Suite is a complex application. It's a database. It's an application server. It's middleware. And it's a complex application on top of that. So what happens is it often falls between the cracks. Your IT security team doesn't know anything about databases or Oracle Business Suite security. They're focused in on network issues, antivirus, firewalls, routers, things like that. They tend not to step into the realm of the Oracle Business Suite. And you've got the database administrators who are basically trying to make sure that the damn thing stays up and that they're applying patches and that they're doing maintenance. Security usually is one of the lower priority items for them because one of the problems with security is, well, it impacts how easy it is to maintain the application. It impacts potential uptime. If I change the security setting, there's a potential I can lock everybody out. It used to be years ago, if you changed the app's password, DBAs were afraid to, because if you change the app's password incorrectly, you lock everyone out of the application. That was a very well-founded fear. And when we talk to our clients, probably 4 or 5 years ago, we'd say, yeah, I can understand why the DBAs are afraid to change the app's password. Well, today it's much better, but there's those type of things in the application. Every time they apply a critical patch update, what is it going to break? Oracle doesn't give you detailed testing instructions for critical patch updates, so you don't know what it might break or not break, and so you just have to go through rigorous testing. So the DBAs are just trying to keep this thing up. They always are behind the 8 ball and trying to get changes in, applying patches, so security is not a big focus. And then finally, internal audit. Internal audit is great, and they do a very good job at application controls and segregation of duties if you've got somebody who knows Oracle Business Suite. So I'm not saying every internal auditor knows everything, but if there's a lot of very competent internal auditors who understand the business suite. but unfortunately they don't understand the technical security. We'll go into environments where we actually find the apps password is set to apps. Well, the internal audit signed off on fully on the eBusiness suite. They thought they were doing a great job on segregation duties. Well, they never looked if you had ever applied a critical patch update that you changed the database passwords. And so what happens is now the technical security of the database, of the application server, and of the application at the technical level is really being glossed over. No one's focusing in on it. IT security doesn't know the questions to ask. Internal audit's focused in on the wrong thing. So what happens is it's eBusiness Suite security just falls in between the cracks. Your database is wide open and becomes a lot of issues. And no one knows to ask the right questions. And that's why sitting down in a room with a number of people and walking through, okay, this is what we're doing, and having people ask questions is very critical. So what should you do? If you're one of those groups, if you're internal audit, IT security, DBAs, you need to make sure the application is being secured properly. You got to work with the DBAs to make sure that things are being done, that the secure configuration guide is being addressed. Another area that the secure configuration guide doesn't cover is basically data access. If you're going to lose sensitive data, it's going to be because someone was able to access the database. And you need to know who's accessing what data when, that there's appropriate audit trails, that that's limited. If people don't need access to production, they shouldn't have access to production. Then you should be scrambling data when you're cloning production down to test and development. And so if that person doesn't need access to Social Security numbers, they should only be querying a test or development environment, not production. And the one thing that would keep me up at night if I'm own my own Oracle eBusiness Suite environment is external access. Once you open up Oracle eBusiness Suite to the internet, it's a whole different game. Because hopefully your internal network is at least secure. You're keeping out the other 7 billion humans on the planet out of your environment and maybe just letting in very skilled hackers and your internal employees. But once you open it up to the internet, remember everything's running as the apps user. So any little flaw or problem on the external application server, you have full access to all the data in the environment. So you really should be stressing over the external configuration, external access, and the DMZ. And that's what should be keeping you up at night. Internal people accessing the sensitive data, well, you can at least have some control over that, but once it's open on the internet, there's very little control you have. And the risk is greatest there. So before we go on to the next myth, let's do a little quiz. So basically, this is real live data from one of our clients. And what it's showing is the sys registry dollar history table. And the sys registry dollar history table keeps track of every time you've applied a critical patch update and have done database upgrades. And so basically this table is showing the different database upgrades that have been done to this environment and when critical patch updates have been applied. So you can see the last critical patch update applied was October 2010. So the question here is, what CPU level is this database patched to? So as you can see, and there's nothing tricky here. It's basically all in chronological order. So you can see that it was upgraded from 9.208 to 10.203. They applied some critical patch updates, and they updated to 10.204, and now they've updated to 11.107. So the question is, what CPU level is this database patched to? So hopefully everyone at least has an answer in their mind. So if you had actually answered January 2009, that's the correct answer. And the reason that is basically when you did the upgrade to 11.107, it basically reset your CPU level. So even though they've installed the October 2010 CPU, when you did the upgrade to 11.107, it wiped out that October 2010 CPU and actually backed you to a different CPU level. And I'll explain why that happens in a second. But basically, just want to do a little quiz. So now when we talk about the next myth, when installing or upgrading the latest CPUs, when upgrading or installing the latest version of Oracle, the latest CPUs are already included. Well, we run into this quite often, especially with junior DBAs. Well, we did upgrade the database. We didn't need to apply a CPU because it's obviously there. Well, that's not true. When you do both database and Oracle eBusiness Suite, a lot of people, we kind of get probably a third of the DBAs just don't know this answer, period. A third know it for the database, but don't know it for the eBusiness Suite, and probably a third of the people actually know it for both. So whenever you're actually applying updates to databases and eBusiness Suite, those upgrades and new installs only have the latest CPU at the time of release. So when Oracle comes out, they basically put in the latest CPU code into the latest release, which makes a lot of sense. But there is no magic behind the scenes. So when the new CPU comes out, the update patches don't automatically get that included. So what happens is when you go through different upgrade patches and versions of the eBusiness Suite, those have baseline updates in them. So there's a baseline CPU for every single database patch. This used to not be documented. Oracle recently has been, in the last, I think about 18 months, has been documenting in the CPU release notes, or in the database upgrade and eBusiness Suite upgrade notes. So when you apply 11.203, if you just apply that today, no matter what CPU you have installed in your database, you're going to get July 2011. Because the way versioning works in the eBusiness, or in the database, there is no versioning. So if I apply new code, it will overwrite the old code, even though it was the latest and greatest CPU code. In the eBusiness Suite, that isn't necessarily true. There is much better versioning in the eBusiness Suite, but there are cases when new code will overwrite old code, and just the way it works. Typically within the version, if I have a CPU, so if I go from 12.1.1 to 12.1.3 and I apply 12.1.3, it will not revert much of the code back to 12.1.1. But if I go from 12.06 to 12.1.3, it will revert a lot of code back. So it just depends exactly on the eBusiness Suite side. So the assumption is, well, if there's one vulnerability, that's probably one too many. So remember, when you're ever applying upgrades, you always have to apply the latest CPU. And the reason for that is each upgrade has a baseline, and here they are documented here very clearly, what you'll get when you apply an upgrade or actually install a new version. So if you install 11.203 today, Oracle is not going back into 11.203 and putting in the latest CPUs. So when you download it today from Oracle, it has the July 2011 CPU. So once you install 11.203, you need to apply the October 2012 CPU as soon as you install it. And we catch a lot of people with this. This is much more common than anyone would think. I would say probably 50% of our security assessments for our clients, we are seeing this happening in real life to one or more environments. And the only way you can get around it is always apply the latest CPU. So another myth that we run into all the time is the only modules running are what you have installed, configured, and licensed. If there is a myth here that I have to sit and fight with people consistently, this is the myth. When you install Oracle eBusiness Suite, every single module is installed no matter what. And even though I haven't licensed or configured those modules, parts of those modules can be still accessed. The reason this happens is Oracle's eBusiness Suite is such a highly integrated system, Oracle can't break out modules. So everyone on the call today is running Oracle Student System. Well, we don't run Oracle Student System. We haven't configured it or licensed it. The code is there, and that's what matters. The code for Oracle Student System is running on all of your Oracle eBusiness Suite environments because Oracle can't pull it out. It's such a highly integrated system. And so what they do is, well, they just don't configure it and they don't license it. The problem is a lot of different things happen. If I can access that code, even though it may not be configured or licensed, pieces of it are still accessible. And Oracle eBusiness Suite has a massive footprint. Where this starts to come into play, let's say we're on the internet and we're running iSupplier on the internet. If I don't follow the DMZ configuration very closely, I've got 20,000 web pages running. And so that's very powerful, and all these can access the apps account. So when you're thinking about securing the Oracle eBusiness Suite, it becomes a little bit more complex of a problem because I've got a lot of code running. The one caveat to this is when I'm saying you've got the modules installed, those are for each application component. So if I've got an external application server and I haven't installed the forms component on there, I won't have the Oracle Forms, but I'll have every single web page for every single module. So if I'm also running externally and it's not a concurrent manager server, I won't have the concurrent manager batch processes running there. But I will have every single web page because if it's an internal application server or an external application server, it has every single web page no matter what. And there's no way you can change that, and there's no way to delete those. So that kind of falls into our next myth on number 7. Oracle Critical Patch Updates don't have to be installed if you don't use those modules. We get a lot of our clients when you go through and say, okay, why didn't you install this Critical Patch Update, the most recent one? And they said, oh, when we went through it, we just thought it was like human resources and something else, so we didn't have to install those patches. This isn't necessarily as true as it used to be because Oracle's moved to only cumulative patches for EBS Critical Patch Updates. But still, some people will go through and say, oh, we don't run that module, so we don't have to apply the CPU. The problem is since every module is installed and it can potentially be accessed, every CPU must be installed even if you don't run any of those modules. Because when we're talking about web pages, what typically happens is the web pages that are vulnerable are a lot of times, probably 50% of them are test pages that shouldn't ever be accessed anyways, but for some reason are left over. And then probably 25% are cases where even though the module is not configured or installed, I can still exploit the security vulnerability in the web page before the web page blows up due to a non-configuration. So if there's, let's say, a SQL injection bug, a lot of times it's very early in on the processing of the code, and before the code hits a problem that says, oh, this isn't configured and I can't let you run it, you've already been able to access the SQL injection bug or the security vulnerability that was in that page. So even though you haven't installed a specific module or licensed it or configured it, Oracle Student System's running on your system, so if the next CPU comes out and it's all Oracle Student System, well, you need to apply that CPU no matter what, because most likely one or more, most of those security vulnerabilities can still be accessed even though you don't have that module licensed or configured. As we go back to the chart again, as you can see, this is a typical application server for eBusiness Suite and how many web pages I have. And we're now talking about, it's a big footprint. I've got 20,000 web pages in the Oracle eBusiness Suite environment. That's a huge application. So any problem in any of those different web pages can be readily accessed and it can become a problem. So let's kind of get to the last myth. Our network security will protect Oracle eBusiness Suite from web attacks when deployed externally. As I said before, one of the things that would keep me up at night if I had an Oracle eBusiness Suite environment is the external environment. Because now I've opened it up to 1 billion people who are on the internet. Anyone who can find my web server, and it's actually not that hard, it's pretty easy to, can actually potentially get in. And I have to make sure that that doesn't happen. So now what's happened is I've talked to my network security team and they're saying, oh yeah, no, we've got our intrusion protection system, our intrusion detection system, our web application firewalls, we've got firewalls. Yeah, no problem, it's fully secure. Well, what happens is these are great layers of security. Unfortunately, if you go through and start talking to these vendors, and there's some great vendors out there and they've got great products, none of them have done anything with the Oracle eBusiness Suite. They practically don't even know it exists as an application. So they can give you some protection because they have a lot of them have very generic rules, and then a lot of times what they do is they actually, as soon as someone releases a security vulnerability, they'll actually write rules for those security vulnerabilities and include them in the rule set. Unfortunately, what happens with the Oracle eBusiness Suite is in the Oracle eBusiness Suite, security releases, Oracle doesn't release much information. So these vendors have nothing to go on. So when the latest critical patch update came out from Oracle, these security vendors are not going through those patches and dissecting and figuring out exactly what should be blocked or where there's a potential security vulnerability. They just don't have that time. And unless something is very clearly stated, oh, this web page has a problem, that's the only time they'll include a rule, and that doesn't happen with Oracle eBusiness Suite. So even though you've got all these great products out there, they really don't have any rules. They don't have any protection for the Oracle eBusiness Suite. So if you're relying solely on the network security layers that your network security team is so proud of, well, they're providing minimal protection for the eBusiness Suite. They're providing some important protection in some areas. So like on firewalls, you should be blocking a number of ports. So you should only have the port open to access the Oracle eBusiness Suite. So that should be hopefully 443, which is basically SSL. And they'll provide a little bit of detection on cross-site scripting, SQL injection type attacks, but beyond that, there's very little protection provided by these products. So web application firewalls are one of the key areas that you can actually protect in a web application. Unfortunately, they just don't have the rules, as I've just said, that these vendors are very good vendors. There's actually some pretty good products. Web application firewalls get slammed pretty regularly in the media, but there are actually some good products out there, and they actually do a pretty decent job if you have a good rule set. The problem for Oracle eBusiness Suite is there's not a good rule set. They're not customized for eBusiness Suite. They don't have the rules for the eBusiness Suite, and unless you're spending a huge amount of time and effort trying to set up the learning, and a lot of them actually have learning modes, so you actually put the application out there, they learn what's accessed and not accessed, but that takes a lot of time and effort. Another area with Oracle eBusiness Suite is, as we've talked about, there's 250 modules, so you're running Oracle Student System. Well, unless you do the DMZ configuration exactly right and implement the URL firewall, you potentially have Oracle Student System running on the internet too. So hopefully you can block that also with the web application firewall. Unfortunately, the way Oracle has done their naming standard, there's no simple way to block Oracle Student System just as a second layer to the URL firewall. Another area is there's significant effort and cost. So your web application firewall team are not eBusiness Suite security experts. Unless you're working closely and they're trying to learn the eBusiness Suite, well, that type of knowledge is not going to get into the web application firewall, and they're probably not going to spend the time and effort to try to figure out one web application when they might have hundreds within your organization. So when we're talking about web application firewalls, you really need one specifically designed for Oracle eBusiness Suite. So you need something that will protect against web attacks and known security vulnerabilities in the eBusiness Suite. And that's very hard to do. So someone has to spend the time and effort. And at Integrity, we do that. We look at each release from Oracle and specifically write rules for our web application firewall. And we also are able to limit the EBS modules. So if you've got an Oracle Student System running, we've actually got capability within AppDefend to block any unused EBS modules. Then we also provide a lot of capabilities around application logging and things like that. So it's very critical when you're looking at protecting the eBusiness Suite when it's deployed externally is to have a very specific product that's meant for eBusiness Suite. So when we're talking about the external configuration, this is the one area that would keep me up at night. And so you really have to spend a lot of time reviewing and specifically looking at how is the architecture done. Are you running SSL correctly? Are your firewalls configured correctly? Do you have some sort of web application firewall that is doing something for eBusiness Suite? Potentially running for penetration tests, so you're looking to make sure someone can't get in. The URL firewall configuration works fairly well. Unfortunately, it's a very manual, tedious configuration. It's basically 500 lines of code that you have to comment and uncomment depending on what modules you're running. We find a lot of mistakes within the URL firewall, and if you don't do it right, also autoconfig will automatically turn it off. So you constantly have to be making sure that the URL firewall configuration is enabled and working correctly. And if you look in the Oracle DMZ document, it's actually listed as an appendice, but the URL firewall is actually a mandatory step. Then there's a number of specific steps. So there's the responsibility controller that basically limits what responsibilities can come externally. You have to make sure that's been configured right. So those are a lot of manual steps. Our product App Sentry will actually go through 6 of the 8 major steps and actually tell you if they're configured right in your environment. But the external configuration is a very difficult thing to get right and also maintain over time. So that's one area that you really have to be looking at and spending some time and effort on. So that was basically looking through some myths on the Oracle eBusiness Suite security, and specifically targeting areas that we've had discussions with our clients before, and things that when they've kind of brought up and said, stated as a matter of fact, that really wasn't true. So the whole point of this was just kind of go through and hopefully highlight some areas that a lot of people don't have a great understanding, kind of provide some background on. So now we'll open up to some questions.
Thank you, Steve. Got a couple of questions here. One of them, what specific tests should be done to secure the internet-facing applications?
So as we kind of walk through, when you're looking at the external configuration, going through and spending some time and effort and actually testing and making sure that you can access those pages. One of the recommendations we often do for clients is the network security team often has a tool that will actually go through and check different things. So all you have to do is put in some URLs in that tool. They'll check if they're getting an error or not. The URL firewall will return a 410 error if it's accessing a page that shouldn't be accessible. Well, that's a great way to test it, is just constantly looking at a couple pages to make sure the URL firewall is running correctly. Another area is try to log in externally occasionally, try to access your account externally, because you should not be able to access responsibilities like system administrator. So if you log in with your own account, you should see a limited set of responsibilities, and typically those should be supplier responsibilities, recruitment responsibilities, and things like that. So again, it's an area that you always need to be testing and kind of constantly vigilant, because if someone can find your website and go attack it, and once they get in, they have full control of the apps account, and they can basically do anything in your database they want. You think it might be limited, but there's no internal controls within, or internal firewall within the application that says, well, if it's coming externally, you can only access these tables or anything like that. There's nothing like that. It all runs as apps. So once you find a problem in the external configuration, you're into the entire application. You can pull any data back and things like that.
All right, next question. Does a tool exist to verify the security level for the Oracle eBusiness Suite?
Very good question. Our tool, AppSentry, is the only tool that we know of that will actually scan and check the Oracle eBusiness Suite. So what AppSentry is basically is a vulnerability and security scanner. You basically point it at your eBusiness Suite environment and give it a database login, and they'll do about 300 different checks that from the database, application server, application, and a little bit at the OS level to make sure that you've done everything in the secure configuration guide, you've done everything in the DMZ configuration guides, you've changed all the default passwords. Even if you create a custom database account, it'll check those database accounts. So it does a lot of work to make sure that you've done it appropriately. And it's fully tunable, so you can also set to say if our password length for our organization is 10, it'll actually check against 10. If you say it's 2, actually we've run into that problem before, and it'll check against 2. So it'll check exactly what your security standard is and what our recommendations for securing the eBusiness Suite are, and give you a list of problems and solutions to those problems.
Good. Another one here. What are the important areas for PCI security and compliance?
So anyone who's running credit cards in their Oracle eBusiness Suite environment has to be PCI compliant. A little bit of a misunderstanding and a myth on PCI compliance is, well, if we're not a level 1 or 2 vendor, well, we don't have to do much. Actually, I should have probably included that as a myth. So PCI is payment card industry standard, and they have the data security standard. So anyone who is processing credit cards in their Oracle eBusiness Suite environment has to be fully PCI DSS compliant. And the one minor exception to that is if you're running just your own credit cards for like your employees, like their corporate credit cards, that's excluded. But if you're taking any customer credit cards or anything like that, you have to be fully PCI compliant. Depending on how many credit cards you take, if you're basically Amazon taking over $1 million a year, someone's doing on-site assessments and they're making sure your entire environment's secure. But most eBusiness Suite environments are not large credit card processors. Typically what we see for our clients is, well, they might have a small parts division or something like that. So someone's taking like 50,000 credit cards a year. They're just kind of doing a small parts division or something not huge. Even though you're then considered what would be a level 4 merchant, you still have to be fully compliant, but the reporting requirement is you just actually have to send in a self-assessment each year, and you just kind of do a bunch of check marks. You have your CIO or CFO or one of the officers of the corporation sign that. But you still have to meet all the requirements. And that's kind of a myth. People don't, well, we just did our self-assessment, we don't have to meet all the requirements because they weren't on the sheet. Unfortunately, every single requirement for PCI DSS has to be met. And PCI DSS is a good standard, but it's a bad standard. It's good in that it's very prescriptive. It's bad that it's very prescriptive. Basically, it's 12 major sections with about 200 total requirements that are very specific. It says your password length has to be 8 or more. Your number of failed sign-ons before you lock an account has to be 3. So it's very prescriptive, which is good because you know exactly what you have to do. But unfortunately, with the Oracle E-Business Suite, some of those requirements are very difficult to do. And if I'm just taking some credit card numbers in a small part of the application, well, if I'm running HR, manufacturing, financials, and I'm just doing some orders through eBusiness Suite, well, it's not that order management has to be PCI compliant. My entire application has to be. And what happens to be one of the requirements? Well, your critical patch updates have to be applied within 30 days of release. Well, 30 days of release for the last CPU is coming up now, and I doubt it many people on the call today have their critical patch updates for October 2012 installed. So when you start talking about PCI DSS compliance, there's a lot of different areas that are very difficult to comply with. One is security patches. The second is encryption. Oracle provides out-of-the-box encryption for credit card numbers, but it's disabled by default. So if you are running credit card numbers in the eBusiness Suite environment, you have to go through a specific procedure, even in R12, even 12.1.3, to enable credit card encryption. Another area that's very significant is auditing. PCI spends a lot of time and effort to make sure that there's a very detailed audit trail, because they want to know if you do get a breach and you lose your credit card numbers, the only way they can determine what happened is if there's a lot of audit data. And so PCI requires a lot of audit data, and oh, by the way, you cannot store that on the system that basically is the audit trails from. So you now have to not only turn on database auditing, you have to make sure that database auditing goes to an external system. You can do that easily with the Oracle syslog auditing, so you can actually enable native database auditing and have it go out syslog, but now you have to go send it to something. So you have to have now a third-party system to actually have it go into. There's a lot of good products out there for logging, ArcSight, Envision, Splunk, but now you have to have something like that enabled. So kind of the big 3 areas that you have to really think about is, 1 is critical patch updates, 2 is encryption of the credit card data, and 3 is auditing. And besides that, there's about 197 other requirements that have to be met. A lot of them are documentation, things like that. On our website, we've actually got a fairly detailed PCI DSS compliance requirement, and we walk through each requirement and have a little bit of discussion about what you have to do with the eBusiness Suite. But often it requires a lot more engineering effort and design effort than most people would like, but that's unfortunately the cost of accepting credit card numbers.
All right, Steve, I think that just about wraps up today's session. I want to thank everybody for attending today's e-learning webinar. And our next webinar is scheduled right now for December the 13th, and again, it will be myths concerning the Oracle database. So we'll go in more detail if you want on the database. So again, and you can go to our website to www.integrity.com and be able to register there. And I'll also have an invite out in the next week or 2. So again, thank you for attending our session today, and have a great rest of the week.